I can still smell the chalk dust. Even now, 30 years later, the scent of a freshly erased blackboard takes me right back to Mrs. Winter's 7th grade classroom, where I learned one of the most important lessons of my life, though not one that was on the curriculum. I was 12 years old in the spring of 1993, with skinny legs that seemed too long for my body, and hair. I'd finally convinced my mother to let me wear in braids with colorful beads that clicked together when I moved my head. The sound annoyed Mrs. Winters to no end. I could tell by the way her lips would pinch together whenever I raised my hand. "Amara, please try to keep still," she would say, not bothering to hide her irritation. I was one of only 4 black students in my class at Westbrook Middle School. The demographics weren't surprising for our district, a supposedly good area my parents had stretched their finances thin to move us into, believing the educational opportunities would be worth the sacrifice. That Friday afternoon in April started like any other. The classroom windows were cracked open, letting in the scent of rain-soaked earth and budding trees. Spring fever had infected everyone, including me. I was passing notes with my friend Keisha when it happened. The folded paper had just left my fingertips when Mrs. Winter's voice cut through the classroom like a knife. "Amara Jenkins! What do you think you're doing?" The room went silent. 28 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me, and I felt my stomach drop like I was on a roller coaster. Mrs. Winters marched down the aisle, her sensible pumps clicking on the linoleum floor. She snatched the note from Keisha's desk before she could hide it. "Passing notes in my classroom?" Her voice had that special tone teachers reserve for public humiliation. "I suppose you think your social life is more important than learning about the American Revolution?" I stared at my desk, my cheeks burning. "No, ma'am. Look at me when I'm speaking to you," she snapped. I raised my eyes to meet hers. Mrs. Winters was in her 50s, with hair dyed an unnatural shade of auburn, and always styled in the same rigid helmet. Her eyes were pale blue and cold as ice chips. "I wasn't the only one passing notes," I said quietly. It wasn't defiance, just a statement of fact. Across the room, Tyler Williams and Jacob Miller had been exchanging notes all period. I'd watched them do it at least 3 times. Something flickered across Mrs. Winters' face. "Are you talking back to me?" "No, ma'am. I just... stand up." I slowly rose from my seat, my legs feeling like they might give way beneath me. "Since you seem to think my classroom rules don't apply to you, perhaps you need a reminder of respect and responsibility." She glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the mess that had accumulated throughout the day. Paper scraps on the floor, smudges on the blackboard, textbooks left out. "After class, you will clean this entire room. Every desk, the blackboard, the floor, everything." Whispers rippled through the classroom. This wasn't a normal punishment. Usually detention or a note home was the worst you could expect. "But," I began. "No arguments. And the rest of you," she addressed the class, "will sit and wait until she finishes. Maybe watching your classmate clean up after you will teach. You all something about respecting our shared space." Tyler's hand shot up. "Mrs. Winters, we have basketball practice after school." She smiled thinly. "Don't worry, Tyler. You boys can go to your practice. This doesn't concern you." The unfairness of it hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't the only one passing notes. I wasn't even the only one who'd been caught before. But I was the only one being punished like this. When the final bell rang, my classmates packed up their things, some avoiding my eyes, others giving me sympathetic glances. Mrs. Winters sat at her desk, ostensibly grading papers but clearly watching to make sure I didn't slack off. "The cleaning supplies are in the closet," she said without looking up. I suggest you start with the blackboard." With shaking hands, I retrieved the cleaning bucket. As I began erasing the board, chalk dust filling my nostrils, I heard the doctor open behind me. I turned to see Principal Davis stepping into the room. "Helen, we have that faculty meeting in 5 minutes," he said to Mrs. Winters. She frowned, looking from him to me. "I can't leave just yet. Amara is serving a special detention." Principal Davis glanced at me, then back to Mrs. Winters. "Can't it wait until Monday?" "It's important she learn this lesson now," Mrs. Winters insisted. Then, as if struck by inspiration, she said, "The other students can supervise." A handful of my classmates were still packing up, mostly the ones who lived in my neighborhood and took the late bus. Mrs. Winters pointed to Jessica Miller, the student council president and daughter of the school board chairman. "Jessica, you're in charge. Make sure Amara cleans everything properly before she leaves. The rest of you stay in your seats until she's done." And with that, Mrs. Winters swept out of the room, with Principal Davis, leaving me alone with 6 of my classmates, a bucket of cleaning supplies, and burning humiliation. For a moment after they left, the room was silent. Then Jessica spoke up. "This is so messed up," she said, surprising me. "Amara, you don't have to do this." I paused, the eraser still in my hand. "She'll know if I don't." Jessica hesitated, then pulled out her cell phone, one of those chunky Nokia ones that were just becoming popular. "Not if we all help. It'll get done faster, and we can all leave." "You don't have to," I mumbled, embarrassed. "No, this is stupid," said Marcus Chen, usually the quietest boy in class. "She's just picking on you because—" He trailed off, but we all knew what he meant. It wasn't the first time Mrs. Winters had singled me out. There was the time she'd asked me to demonstrate urban dance moves during our Cultural Heritage Week, or when she'd suggested I might be more comfortable reading simplified English versions of the novels on our reading list, or how she always seemed surprised when I got good grades, asking more than once if I'd had help with my assignments. "Hold up," said Keisha, reaching for Jessica's phone. "I'm recording this. My cousin told me you should always get evidence." "Evidence of what?" I asked. Keisha just gave me a look. "Evidence of her treating you different, girl." The 6 of them helped me clean the room in record time. Jessica and Marcus wiped down the desks. Keisha and Daniel swept the floor. David and Tanya organized the bookshelves. I finished the blackboard and windows. As we worked, Keisha kept the phone recording, panning around the room occasionally while narrating, in a whisper. So Mrs. Winters made only Amara stay after to clean everything by herself, even though Tyler and Jacob were passing notes too, and she didn't punish them at all. When we finished, the classroom looked better than it had in months. We gathered our bags, a sense of solidarity hanging in the air. "Thanks," I said, my throat tight with emotion. "You guys didn't have to help?" "Yes, we did," Jessica said firmly. "It wasn't fair what she did." "It wasn't just unfair," Keisha added, handing the phone back to Jessica. "It was something else." We all knew what that something else was, but nobody said it out loud. We didn't have to. The late bus had already left, so I had to walk home. It gave me time to think about whether to tell my parents what had happened. Mom would be upset, might even go to the school to complain. Dad would get that quiet, sad look he sometimes got when he had to explain another hard truth about the world. Part of me just wanted to forget it ever happened. But when I walked through the door and Mom took one look at my face, the whole story came tumbling out. "She made you do what?" My mother's voice was dangerously calm. "Clean the classroom, by myself, as punishment for passing notes. I twisted my hands in my lap, but some of the other kids stayed to help me. That was kind of them, Mom said, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. She exchanged a look with my father that I couldn't decipher. Is Grandpa Luther still coming for dinner? Dad asked her. Mom nodded slowly. Yes, and I think he needs to hear this. My stomach clenched. Grandpa Luther was my father's father, a man whose presence filled any room he entered. He'd been a civil rights lawyer in the 60s and 70s, working on school desegregation cases across the South. Even in his 70s, he remained sharp as a tack and didn't suffer fools or injustice gladly. When Grandpa arrived that evening, I was instructed to tell him exactly what had happened. His face remained impassive as I spoke, but I could see the fire kindling in his eyes. And this teacher, Mrs. Winters, she's done things like this before. I hesitated. Not exactly like this, but yeah. She treats me different. Different how? His tone was gentle but insistent. I told him everything. The reading list incident, the dance comment, the surprised looks when I did well on tests. With each example, his expression grew darker. Jessica recorded it, I added. On her cell phone. Grandpa Luther's eyebrows rose. Did she now? Smart girl. He seemed to make a decision. Amara, would you be willing to show me your school tomorrow morning? I looked at my parents in confusion. Tomorrow's Saturday. I know, he said. But I happen to know that your school board holds its monthly meeting on Saturday mornings, and I think it's time they heard about what's happening in Mrs. Winters' classroom, my parents exchanged. Another look. Dad, my father began. Are you sure that's necessary? Grandpa Luther fixed him with a steady gaze. Son, what would I have told you when you were Amara's age? When that teacher in Virginia said you weren't college material? My father's shoulders straightened, almost imperceptibly. You told me never to let anyone define my potential. Exactly. Grandpa turned back to me. Amara, this isn't just about you. It's about every child who looks like you, who will pass through Mrs. Winters' classroom after you're gone. Sometimes standing up isn't just for yourself. It's for those who come after. The next morning, I found myself wearing my Sunday best on a Saturday, sitting between my parents in the back of the school board meeting room. Grandpa Luther sat directly behind us, dignified in a suit that looked like it had witnessed history. The regular agenda items dragged on. Budget approvals, facility maintenance schedules, curriculum updates. During a brief recess, Grandpa Luther approached Jessica's father, Mr. Miller, who recognized him immediately. They spoke in low tones at the side of the room. I watched as Mr. Miller's expression shifted from polite interest to deep concern. He glanced over at me once, then nodded firmly to my grandfather. When the meeting reconvened, Mr. Miller raised his hand. Before we continue, I'd like to introduce someone who has requested a moment to address the board on an urgent matter. Many of you may recognize Luther Jenkins, the distinguished civil rights attorney. He's here regarding a situation involving his granddaughter at Westbrook Middle School. A murmur swept through the room as Grandpa Luther stood and made his way to the podium. Principal Davis, who was present for the meeting, suddenly looked very alert. I spotted Mrs. Winters in the audience. She taught weekend enrichment classes and often attended board meetings. Her face had drained of color. Thank you for this opportunity, Grandpa Luther began, his deep voice commanding immediate attention. Yesterday, my granddaughter Amara was subjected to discriminatory treatment by a teacher at your school. He recounted the incident calmly but forcefully, his legal training evident in how he presented the facts. When he mentioned the recording, Mrs. Winter's head snapped up. "That's preposterous," she interrupted, standing up. "I would never single out a student based on race. Amara was being disruptive and disrespectful." "Were the other students passing notes also required to clean the classroom?" Grandpa Luther asked. "That's different," Mrs. Winter stammered. "They had extracurricular commitments." "So did my granddaughter," he countered. "She had a family dinner to attend. Or do only certain activities count as commitments in your classroom?" Mrs. Winter's face flushed red. "You're twisting my words. This girl has been a discipline problem all year." "Is that so?" Grandpa Luther turned to Principal Davis. "Mr. Davis, what is Amara's disciplinary record?" The principal looked uncomfortable. "Amara has never been sent to my office. Her conduct, marks have been excellent." "This is absurd," Mrs. Winter sputtered. "The girl is exaggerating what happened." That's when Jessica stood up from where she was sitting with her father. "I have proof," she said, her voice trembling slightly but determined. She held up her phone. "I recorded what happened after Mrs. Winters left." The board chairman, Jessica's father, looked grave. "I think we need to hear this recording." Jessica connected her phone to the room's sound system with the help of the IT person present. Soon the voices of my classmates filled the room, along with Keisha's narration describing what Mrs. Winters had done. The recording captured our conversation about previous incidents, and finally, the sound of us all cleaning together. When it ended, the room was silent. Mrs. Winters stared straight ahead, her face now ashen. Grandpa Luther broke the silence. "This isn't an isolated incident. It represents a pattern of behavior toward my granddaughter that can only be described as discriminatory. That's a serious allegation," the board chairman said. "Yes, it is," my grandfather agreed, "and one I'm prepared to pursue formally if necessary. However, I believe in giving institutions the opportunity to address issues internally first." He laid out a series of requests: an investigation into Mrs. Winter's treatment of minority students, a review of the school's discipline policies for bias, and cultural competency training for all staff. "And I believe my granddaughter deserves an apology," he concluded. The board went into closed session to discuss the matter, asking us to wait outside. As we stood in the hallway, Mrs. Winters approached us, her eyes darting nervously. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, addressing my grandfather rather than looking at me. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Grandpa Luther interrupted calmly, "is your belief that you could treat my granddaughter this way, without consequences." Mrs. Winters finally looked at me, something desperate in her eyes. "Amara, you know I've always tried to help you succeed. I'd never stood up to a teacher before. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But I thought about what Grandpa had said, about standing up not just for yourself, but for those who come after." "No, Mrs. Winters," I said, quietly. "You've always treated me like I don't belong in your classroom, like I'm not as smart or as good as the other kids, and that's not help, that's hurt." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Before she could respond, we were called back into the meeting room. The board had reached a decision. Mrs. Winters would be placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. The school would implement all of Grandpa Luther's suggested measures. And the chairman personally apologized to me and my family. "This isn't the standard we expect from our educators," he said firmly. "And I'm especially disappointed as Jessica was involved in this situation and didn't feel she could come to me directly. As we left the building, a small crowd of students and parents had gathered. Word had spread quickly. Keisha was there with her mother. So were Marcus, Jessica, and several other classmates. They surrounded me, offering support and sharing their own stories about Mrs. Winters that they'd never told before. It was a bittersweet victory. I hadn't wanted to cause a scene or get a teacher in trouble. But as Grandpa Luther reminded me, on the drive home, sometimes justice feels uncomfortable, even when it's right. The investigation revealed that Mrs. Winters had a history of treating minority students differently, holding them to stricter standards, offering less encouragement, expressing surprise at their achievements. She never returned to our classroom. Instead, we got a substitute for the rest of the year. Miss Coleman, a young teacher who made history come alive and treated everyone with the same high expectations and respect. Before the school year ended, Principal Davis instituted a new anti-bias training program for all staff. I was asked to be part of a student advisory committee to help develop more inclusive policies. The incident that had humiliated me had somehow transformed into something empowering, not just for me, but for our whole school community. Grandpa Luther stayed for a week after the board meeting, telling me the stories about his legal cases and teaching me about the power of standing up with dignity. Always remember, he told me, that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but don't ever let anyone treat you as less than the remarkable person you are. Those words stayed with me through high school, college, and law school. Yes, I followed in my grandfather's footsteps. Though my focus became education law, his example showed me how to transform painful experiences into purposeful action. 20 years after that day in Mrs. Winters' classroom, life served up an irony I couldn't have scripted. I was working on a case involving teacher certification, requirements when a name on a witness list caught my eye. Helen Winters, the woman who walked into my office, was not the imposing figure I remembered. Time had shrunk her somehow. Her once rigid auburn hair had gone gray and hung limply around a face lined with age and what looked like hardship. "Ms. Jenkins?" she said, not recognizing me. "I'm Helen Winters. I was told you needed my testimony about the old certification procedures." I studied her for a long moment. "Please, sit down, Mrs. Winters." Her eyes narrowed slightly at my use of Mrs. rather than Ms., a small detail that suggested familiarity. "Have we met before?" she asked. "Westbrook Middle School," I said, quietly. "7th grade, 1993. The color drained from her face as recognition dawned. "Amara," she whispered. I nodded, surprised at how calm I felt. "It's been a long time." I didn't know you became a lawyer." Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "Following my grandfather's footsteps," I said. The mention of Grandpa Luther made her flinch slightly. "I never taught again after that year," she volunteered after an uncomfortable silence. "Couldn't get hired with the mark on my record." I had wondered what had happened to her. "What have you been doing instead?" "Administrative work, mostly. Temporary positions." She looked down at her hands. "It's been difficult." I could have felt satisfaction at her downfall. Part of me, the wounded 12-year-old who still lived somewhere inside me, did. But the woman I'd become recognized something else. A person who'd never confronted her own biases and paid a heavy price for it. "Mrs. Winters," I said carefully, "I still need your testimony for this case. Your experience with the old certification system is valuable evidence." She looked up, surprised. "You still want my help? After what I did to you? This isn't about what happened back then. This is about making education better now." I paused. That's what I've dedicated my career to." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll help however I can." After we finished the business at hand as she was gathering her things to leave, she paused at the door. "Amara," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. For everything. Not just what happened that day, but for all of it. I didn't understand then what I was doing. I thought—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. What I thought. I was wrong." It wasn't a grand moment of redemption, just a simple, belated acknowledgement of harm done, but it was sincere. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. Then, making a decision, I added, "My office is looking for an administrative assistant with education experience. It's a permanent position with benefits. If you're interested, I can arrange an interview." Her eyes widened in shock. "Why would you do that for me?" I thought about what my grandfather had taught me about justice, dignity, and rising above, because sometimes people deserve a second chance to do better. She didn't take the job. Perhaps it would have been too complicated for both of us. But she did volunteer to speak at one of our training sessions on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias in education. Her perspective as someone who had enacted that bias and faced the consequences proved powerful. Looking back on that pivotal moment in 7th grade, I realized that the lesson wasn't just about standing up against injustice. It was about understanding that even painful experiences can lead to growth and change, not just for the victim, but sometimes for the perpetrator too. I often wonder what would have happened if my classmates hadn't helped me that day, if Jessica hadn't recorded the incident, if Grandpa Luther hadn't shown up at that board meeting. How many small acts of discrimination would have continued unchallenged? How many students would have internalized the message that they were somehow less deserving of respect? Have you ever had a moment when standing up changed something beyond yourself? Or a time when someone stood up for you when you couldn't? I'd love to hear your story. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us remember that change often starts with one person willing to say, "This isn't right." If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Maybe someone facing their own Mrs. Winters, or someone who needs a reminder of their power to make a difference. Because in the end, that's what Grandpa Luther taught me, that chalk dust eventually settles, but the courage to stand up for what's right leaves marks that last a lifetime.